Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for taking the time to attend this presentation today. I really appreciate all of your support. For the sake of the camera in the audience today is my family, my mom and my dad and my sister, my mother-in-law, as well as a few of my friends and my roommates, and a few of the pastors from my church. To be considerate of all of your time today, I'm going to move through the material fairly quickly. We do have a lot to cover. Feel free to take notes, as there will be a Q&A time at the end. I want you to close your eyes and imagine with me. It's a cold spring day, it's raining outside, and you want nothing more than to curl up in your favorite spot with a warm drink and a blanket and just spend the rest of the day engulfed in a story. And as you're reading, the world around you begins to fade away. All of a sudden, you're brought back to reality. The light bulb went out in your lamp. So you get up, go to the cabinet, and your heart sinks as you realize there are no replacement light bulbs. So your day in has turned to a day out. And so you navigate your way through the slick and wet terrain, braving the storm. You get to the light bulb aisle, and as you scan the many options before you, your eyes begin to glaze over as you're assaulted with words like lumens, watts, candles, life hours, fluorescent, LED, incandescent, not to mention all the many facts and figures that go along with each purchase. This plethora of options might be common to us now, but it wasn't too long ago that light bulbs only came in one type. All you had to do was choose the shape. However, understanding these types of light bulbs is not the only factor at play during this decision-making process. The energy use reduction by switching types of light bulbs has been a force-fed mantra of the mainstream culture so that the consumer can become earth-friendly, eco, or green in their choices. Essentially, we're complicating the decisions of consumers in a way that morally, philosophically, and financially incentivizes them to purchase the technologically advanced light bulb. Most people, however, know that they no longer use the round light bulbs because the spiral ones are better for the planet and their pocketbooks. Little do they know that perhaps neither of these claims are true. And though this is just a small example, many of us have different opinions of what it means to be earth-friendly or green. But where do these ideas come from? And this, as we'll see, is just the tip of the iceberg. The modern environmentalism movement is a large and complicated subculture which is charged with a variety of opinions and emotions across a vast array of different topics. I'm going to start today by telling their story, and then we'll dive into the biblical story and finally land in a place where these two stories intersect. Where are the places where these two paths cross? Where does the biblical worldview become the foundation of environmental activism? Many people believe that the modern environmentalism movement began with the publication of Silent Spring by Rachel Carson in 1962, which brought awareness to the public conscious many of the environmental abuses that were going on during that day. The name Silent Spring comes from the transformation of the spring season on the modern commercial farm. The abusive use of chemical fertilizer and biocides killed all the flush of life and sound normally associated with the spring season. This abusive use eventually led to spring on the farm becoming a silent time. In Lament, Carson reflectively says, there remains in this space-age universe the possibility that man's way is not always best. Well, this silent spring eventually led to what some called the noisy summer and the creation of the EPA in 1970. One author describes this time as a generation of people who were proud to protest this and that. He goes on to say there seemed to be no positive direction forward, and although almost everybody could define those aspects of global society that they rejected, these included military adventurism, the nuclear bomb, ruthless land exploitation, the arrogance of polluters, and a general insensitivity to human needs. An unethical world could waste more on killing people than on earth care or helping people. Others were seeking what we would call today sustainable solutions, before that really became a part of the vernacular. This first wave of modern environmentalism, as it's called, there was intense discussion about the limits to growth because of the limits to resources fueled by an oil crisis, and the limits of the environment reflected by increased pollution, biodiversity loss, and land degradation. And in these two examples, we begin to see one of the major divisions within the modern movement: oppositional, protest-based environmentalism, and positive, solutions-based environmentalism. And the debate is really centered on what is driving cultural change forward. Is cultural change driven by protest to undesirable social or cultural institutions, what we would call maybe the air game? Or is it by practicing and implementing small-scale positive solutions, specifically those that the people on the ground implement, not those at the top should implement? Specifically, again, is how are we people, the average people, going to go and create the world that we do want? It's what we at New Story would call the ground game. Well, many, like Mollison and Holmgren, decided that opposition to the emerging space age universe was not going to work. So they walked away from society, particularly to create the worlds that they did want for themselves and for their families. After a few weeks, Mollison, when he was reflecting on this period of time, said that he asked himself, am I going to just sit here and let the bastards roll over everything? No. So he and Holmgren, the two authors referenced before, decided that they were going to develop a positive solution system that could be taught to others, to equip them with skills and knowledge to create the life that they did want. This led to the development of a new concept, and which became known as the system of permaculture. It's, strictly speaking, a combination of the words permanent and agriculture. But more precisely, it's defined as a system to produce a permanence in culture, that is, a stability of human and ecosystemic flourishing. The permaculture concept was first introduced through a series of pamphlets entitled Introduction to Permaculture, and was later known as Permaculture 1 in 1978, explaining the concepts, theories, and principles of beneficial ecosystem design. It was received so enthusiastically by those seeking sustainable solutions that it prompted a second publication. This became creatively known as Permaculture 2 in 1979, and this further elaborated on the implementation of the principles introduced in the first publication. By 1981, Mollison was awarded the Right Livelihood Award, which is sometimes referred to as the Alternative Nobel Prize. This further launched him into the international spotlight, and he began to travel extensively, teaching and designing all around the world. Yet his most significant work, without a doubt, is the Permaculture Designer's Manual, which was published in 1988. This 576-page book is extremely information-dense. Every sentence feels like a paragraph. Every paragraph feels like a chapter, and every chapter feels like an entire book. It is a combination and elaboration on the first two publications. The content is arranged rather interestingly to be it's designed to be taught as a course, which eventually became known as the Permaculture Designer's course, or PDC. It is accepted as college credit at a growing number of institutions. And though it's not required to be a part of the permaculture community, it is what Holmgren describes as the social glue, which binds the global community together. As a movement, permaculture sits squarely in the center of positive solutions-based environmentalism. So, what is permaculture? We know that it's not just another form of environmental protest, and it's not simply a different kind of agriculture. So what is it? How does it make good on its promise to produce flourishing ecosystems and human settlements? Well, permaculture is a system of design. So think sustainable architecture mixed with ecological landscape design mixed with food production. It is, in one phrase, working with nature rather than against it. There are many different components and layers to the system described above, but it's not the purpose of this presentation, nor is there really enough time to fully extrapolate all of them. Instead, for our purposes, it's more helpful to focus on what uniquely sets permaculture apart as a design system. It begins with how we should act, or ethics, and then moves to what deeper realities or principles ground our behavior, and finally teaching us what appropriate actions we should take. So for the ethics, there are three, and they are fairly simple. They are earth care, people care, and fair share. Earth care and people care are fairly self-explanatory. It's looking out for the benefit of both the people and the planet. Fair share is a little bit more complicated, but it's fairly simple as well. It's setting limits to our consumption and reproduction and redistributing the surplus back out to humanity and ecosystem alike. The principles are summarized in 12 short little phrases. I'm going to just quickly read through all of them, but you can see them on the graphic here as well. They are: observe and interact, catch and store energy, obtain a yield, apply self-regulation and accept feedback, use and value renewable resources and services, produce no waste, design from the patterns to the details, integrate rather than segregate, use small and slow solutions, use and value diversity, use edges and value the marginal, creatively use and respond to change. And for our purposes, there are really only two other major philosophical assumptions in permaculture we're going to touch on today. The first is an emphasis on individual responsibility within community. Mollison says, humanity has expanded our right to live on the earth to an entitlement to conquer the earth. And the only ethical decision is to take responsibility for our own existence and that of our children. This is what he describes as the prime directive of permaculture. The other fundamental assumption is that life is cooperative rather than competitive. That is, it is survival of the most cooperative rather than survival of the fittest. Even the bacteria live by collaboration, accommodation, exchange, and barter, says Bill Mollison, and we too must learn to collaborate to produce abundance for both ecosystem and humanity alike. But before we continue, you might be asking yourself, why are we diving into this particularly obscure subculture of the environmentalism movement? Well, as I alluded to earlier, permaculture gives us a unique window and access to many of the diverse subcultures of the environmentalism movement. The beliefs and values and lifestyles of the permaculture community are fairly representative of the entire positive solutions-based environmentalism movement. And in fact, they could be seen as representative of the environmental movement as a whole. While it's maybe not entirely, maybe not in their entirety would they apply, but for most people they seem to ascribe to them. And permaculture is unique because they spell out their ethics and their values, as we've seen already. And so when we get a very quick identification of what these people value in the world. So who are these people? What are they like? What's driving them? First, it's me. The countless hours and the lecture and recorded interviews and books and movies and magazines and music and YouTube videos and internet searches that I've consumed over my journey have significantly informed my perspective of permaculture and its adherents. Additionally, I'm currently in a PDC with Geoff Lawton, which is the Permaculture Designer Certificate course I mentioned earlier. The course has given me particular access to the subculture and the people there, and through it I was able to connect with a variety of people willing to participate in my surveys, questionnaires, and phone interviews. And so having begun to describe some of these people, you may have begun to paint a picture of what they're like in their head. We know kind of what they believe, and so you've run into these people before. They're the bunch of tie-dye hippie, flower power, earth-worshipping, pot-smoking, tree-hugging, communal cult-living, left-wing lunatics. And you're right. But that's not really the only person we find here. And in fact, of the people that I surveyed, the majority were middle-aged female property owners with some form of college education. And they owned just about 2.5 acres as an average in suburban or rural areas. In my previous experience with permaculture, these were not the people that I typically came across. And instead, I was surprised when the income data started to come in, and it was fairly high. I had expected a lower average income due to the fact that I've seen a lot of permaculture work being done in developing countries. It seems that the average high income is due to the fact that my sample was primarily made up of people in countries with significantly higher average income. Those countries that were particularly prominent were Australia and the United States. This is similar to the population of the course, but it's not the entire story of who is in the course with me, as we can see from this course map. Each of these pinpoints represents a person that I am in school with. My hypothesis is that you can see there's particular concentrations in America and in Australia and then in Europe as well. It seems that the primary language being English was a limiting factor for those non-English speaking countries. And as you can see from this map, we are starting to get a picture that the permaculture movement is global in scale. The Permaculture Research Institute has developed a list of registered permaculture projects and demonstration sites. These are large-scale farms which are putting on display the ethics and principles and actions of permaculture. We do see concentrations again in America and Australia, with 664 in North America and just shy of 250 in Australia. There's also a heavy concentration in Europe with 388 registered sites in Europe. But what we're not seeing on this map, there are 202 registered sites in South America, 105 in Africa, 32 in the Middle East, 164 in Asia, and there are even 5 projects in Antarctica and 3 inside the Arctic Circle, which is crazy. I don't know what they're doing there, but I'd sure like to find out. But I've still not touched on one of the most globally divisive demographics, and that's religion. The extreme majority of those surveyed said that permaculture applies to all areas of life. Yet those that did not think so tended to leave out politics and religion, just like every happy family holiday party. And so I was beginning to see this divide. This confirms some of my experience with the movement. There are typically two kinds of people you come across. Those that treat permaculture as a logic-based science, that is, they functionally behave as if there is no God, and those that blend a combination of religions and spiritualities into a sort of neo-paganism or New Age spirituality. The scientific emphasis or absence of religion comes from the founders, which warned against mixing of permaculture with spiritualism with almost an atheistic zeal. The other side, what is commonly referred to as the Gaia side, Gaia is the Greek goddess of the earth. These people mix earth care with blatant creation worship, which comes in a variety of different forms and intensities. Yet I was wrong, again, that these were not the only people I came across, as you can see from my data here. Yet I wasn't totally off in some of my experiences. The atheistic, agnostic presence is nearly double that of the global concentration. And of those that selected the other category, many described themselves in various loosely defined spiritualities, which is extremely high when you consider the global concentration. In fact, it's nearly 5 times the global concentration. I was surprised, however, to find so many Christians within the movement. In my journey, I have not come across very many of them. So, the sample of my sample of the subgroup is nearly 1/3 atheist agnostic, 1/3 Christian, and 1/3 what we'll say is New Age spirituality. How are these people of such vastly different belief systems getting along? I mean, think about it. A priest, an atheist, and a shaman walk into a bar, and they have a riveting conversation about improving the condition of the world and are determined to leave as partners to improve the lives of their communities. Is it a joke? But it seems like it's reality. When G.F. Lawton looked over the first Permaculture Voices conference, he looked out over the crowd and he said, "When I look out, I see a typical group of permaculture people. You're all different ages, different backgrounds. A lot of you are different ethnic backgrounds, different cultures, different life experiences. It would be really hard to put you all in one room normally." That's what a group of permaculture people look like. We look like a real mixed up mob. Well, they say the most segregated time in America is on Sunday mornings. And so if the church is struggling to unite a diverse people, what is gathering and uniting these diverse people in the permaculture movement? Well, I asked a smaller group in a questionnaire why they thought the movement was united, and though they did respond by recognizing the divisions that we have mentioned previously, they always came back that the common ground was the ethics. Additionally, 8 of the 13 people in that questionnaire said that the ethics were the most impactful part of the permaculture system for them. And of the 7 people I interviewed, 6 of them said that the permaculture movement just seemed to fit into the ethics they already developed. Some citing the chicken or the egg conundrum. They don't know what came first, my ethics or the permaculture ethics. They just seemed to blend so well together. But what is driving these people? What's motivating them? How are they united and motivated together? It seemed that it was a combination of 2 things, a feeling that the world is filled with incredible injustice and chaos. Many were looking to improve the lives of their families and communities, and for some, this meant retreating and building paradise away from society, seeking what they would describe as a place or space I can call home, fresh water, enough food to eat, and community to share all the above with who are supportive and accept me as I am. It seems they're seeking to control the world around them due to a feeling that the world is in chaos. For others, they're overwhelmed by the terrible political and corporate injustices, burdened by the task of be the change. When I asked what was causing their fears, angers, and anxieties, they responded with answers like war, climate change, disrespect and abuse of life, media reporting primarily bad news, materialism, consumerism built on systems of unlimited economic growth. One person responded saying, "We piss away our dwindling resources while we need them to build and design our way into a new era. Instead, squandered for the benefit of some seriously evil shitheads." So it seems that permaculture people enter the system with a sense that the world is falling apart around them. And though they have different ideas of how they should respond, either retreat or intentional engagement, most of them land and drop anchor in these ethics that we've talked about before. So if we were to summarize the story of permaculture people, it might go as follows. Permaculture people come from a variety of cultures, family backgrounds, religions, ethnicities, socioeconomic statuses, and yet they're all united by a feeling that the people and the earth are not being cared for in a way that is ethical or acceptable. This feeling of dissension drives them to take personal responsibility for their lives and families in a way that produces healthy and thriving environments for all individuals and communities in which they inhabit. So, having described the general permaculture story, we turn now to take a look at the story that belongs to the church, but is offered to the whole world, to everyone, the biblical narrative. Many find it helpful to describe the narrative that follows in four major movements: creation, fall, redemption, and restoration. Still others find that the story of Scripture develops in a series of covenants, which begin in Genesis and progressively build on one another until they find consummation in Revelation. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The first two chapters of Genesis tell the creation story from two different but not competing perspectives. The first chapter elaborates the days of creation in rhythmic and poetic, almost musical repetition. God speaks and he creates and he comments. He speaks, creates, and comments. God says, "Let there be," and it is so, and he says, "It is good." It's not until verse 26 that there is a break in the pattern, something like a divine pause to draw in the attention of the reader. God forms humanity from the dust in their own image. God says, "Let us make humanity in our own image." Just as God formed humanity from the dust, they are called to take the already existing materials in the universe and form them in ways that physically express the goodness and other characteristics of God. They are told to fill and subdue the earth, that is, to rule over it. After that, God rests and institutes the Sabbath day of holiness. The second telling of creation focuses primarily on the beginning of humanity. Chapter 2 plays around with the words dust and ground really interestingly in a way that will shed light on the curses of the coming chapter. The ground and dust freely gives life, and God makes all plants, animals, and humans out of this material. The Lord causes the soil to produce all life on earth, and it's the God-ordained place from which all life arises. In this second chapter, humanity is placed in the garden to care for creation and to maintain it. In chapter 1, humanity is given power over creation. In chapter 2, they're tasked to continue to develop it in ways in which God would say it is good. The world does not remain in this perpetual harmony, for dissonance enters the narrative with just one small half step away from God. The single act of disobedience, the eating of the prohibited tree of the knowledge of good and evil, breaks the shalom, or the perpetual harmony of the garden, and humanity experiences shame for the first time. The initial blame game that follows is almost comical, but the confrontation by God does not end in a humorous way. God curses all those responsible for the shattered vision of shalom. And if this new reality can be described in one word, it would be death. The serpent is forced to crawl on his belly and eat dust. Dust. Remember, the place that is the source of life. The serpent becomes the consumer of life, directly in competition with the calling of humanity to create and steward life. Yet even before the rest of the curses are spelled out, God interjects with a promise. The woman will produce an offspring which shall be touched by the life-consuming bite of the serpent, which seems to allude to death for that individual. But instead, God will turn the tables, and the person bitten by death will crush the source of its power. The woman is cursed with pain and childbirth. This is a direct influence on her divine calling and creation mandate to be fruitful and multiply. The continued expression of the divine attributes in creation by humanity is now paired with pain and suffering. Humanity is still in the image of God, and they're still called to reflect Him in the rest of creation, but the glory of God in doing so is now connected to suffering, and only by going through suffering can the woman express the image of God in creating life. The man is cursed through a curse of the ground, which initially kind of seems like a cop-out. This guy got off easy, but when we view all of these as symbolic, we see that the ground which formerly freely produced food for humanity, fueling the work of the creation mandate, now requires hard work and sacrifice on the part of humanity. Humankind must enter sorrow, pain, labor, hardship, and toil in order to experience the life-giving power which comes from the soil in the form of food. If all the punishments weren't clear enough, humanity is explicitly punished with death, the symbolic unmaking and dismantling of creation. Death dissolves life into the dust from which it came. The ground no longer freely gives life, but requires suffering leading to death to sustain its life-giving power. After the fall, the condition of the world continually deteriorates until every intention of the thoughts of their heart is only evil continually. This prompts the Lord to cover the face of the earth in a great flood, destroying all life. And as Noah and his family leave the ark, they are commanded to be fruitful and multiply. It's almost a divine restart. But the story reveals that the corruption of the fall has percolated through to all parts of creation. And by the time we get to the story of the Tower of Babel, we see that the unity and shalom of the garden has fully collapsed. In Abraham, we see a man who enters into a relationship with God that is similar to that of the garden. He is promised land, offspring, and blessing in order to be a blessing to the entire earth. It sounds as if the offspring of this man will be that promised snake crusher referred to in Genesis 3. Yet Abraham is not the promised snake crusher, and as we see through his corruption and death and the corruption and death of his offspring, neither are they. Who will save us from this serpent of death. Well, Genesis ends with the death of Joseph, perhaps the godliest person in the book, and the hope of a good moral person who can enter suffering and remain kind is still not enough to separate humanity from their deadly condition. In Exodus, we learn of the birth of Moses, and through him, the covenantal relationship of God continues to develop. In this Mosaic covenant, God confines himself to a particular relationship with the people of Israel. The covenant, the first 5 books of the Bible, if seen simplistically, is a list of commandments that Israel must keep in order to maintain right relationship with God. If they do not keep them, they shall be cursed or punished, just like the garden. Here, sacrifice and death is explicitly required to maintain life with God. The following story, the rest of the Old Testament, is a continual descent into further disrepair and destruction, so that Israel and Judah are split and eventually cut off from the land promised to Abraham, a land which flowed with seeming abundant symbols of life. There's really only one person in this story that truly stands out as a glimmer of hope, and that's King David. Because of his faithfulness and love toward God, he is the promised snake crusher is promised to come from his line, from the house of David, and his throne shall be established forever. Yet even David is not able to live up to the standards of the Mosaic covenant, and he too lays down in death with his fathers. Now the nation of Israel is in a place where they are abandoned by God. They no longer have the promised king or land. They are divided and scattered as a nation. The temple, which was once filled with the presence of God, is abandoned by him and destroyed brick by the Babylonians. Yet hope remains. The prophet Jeremiah speaks of a time when God will remember his people and make a new covenant with them. Since they broke the relationship by disobeying the law, God promises to write the laws on their hearts, and he will forgive their iniquity and remember their sin no more. The presence of God shall once again fill the temple, and it shall come with a sound like the rushings of many waters. Yet he shall not be contained only to the temple. His rushing presence shall begin to flow and become a great river of life. As it flows and makes its way through the landscape, we see images of the garden again, life teeming in waters and trees springing up from the banks. Wherever the river goes, the curse is reversed, and the ground produces life freely, and the leaves of the plants are for healing, and they provide incorruptible food. Equipped with these images of how God will remain faithful to his people, Israel waits for the Son of David to arise and crush the snake of death. And though I've passed over a great many details in this story, we have finally arrived at the man they call Jesus. He was born into this world of expectation with such a great history and promise. He lives and fulfills all the promises and prophecies given by God. He's the perfect Israelite and son of David, and everyone expects him to take the throne in power, but in a dramatic turn of events, he becomes both mediator and sacrificial lamb, fulfilling the requirement of the Mosaic covenant. He is the true descendant of Abraham, from which God does not stay the knife, and yes, he is the snake crusher who is bitten and enters death, even entering the ground through the tomb, only to return and crush the head of the life-consuming serpent. The price of the law, the requirement of the curse has been fulfilled, so humanity is redeemed. The presence of the Lord enters the temple again. Only this time, the temple is the church, the body of Christ, and the law is contained in their hearts. Therefore, it is from the followers of Jesus that Ezekiel's river flows. Being filled with the Holy Spirit, we as believers are the mediating presence of God in the earth, capable of producing life and healing wherever we go. The command to be fruitful and multiply, to have power paired with responsibility, remains for us. In the way it is described in Ezekiel, those filled with the presence of God seem to be the gateway through which all creation can be regenerated and restored to glory, perhaps even a greater glory than that of the garden. Yet, anyone who is still breathing knows that the world is far from restored to the original shalom of the garden. The world is caught in perpetual oscillation between life and death. Jesus has initiated the new covenant, but it is far from consummated. The church, which is blessed to be a blessing, has not spread to every corner of the earth, and therefore the redemption we are tasked with and connected to is still under construction. Yet we know there will be a time when all things will be made new, when we will no longer have to enter into the suffering of Jesus to experience life. There will come a day when the church, the people of God, will inherit the resurrected earth. The presence of God will fill the earth, and will require no mediator, for death and sin will be removed, and there will be no divide between humanity and divinity. God eternally and completely with us. Until then, we have a lot of mediating to do. This is our story. But it's also the story of the whole world and of humanity. And now we, as the mediating presence of Jesus, are called to go into that world and to be Jesus. That is, to incarnate gospel realities in the cultures and societies in which we encounter. If this gospel is to be good news, it must be a lived reality. It must be an incarnate worldview. We live this life at the crossroads, on the corner of Gospel Street and World Avenue. So where does the gospel intersect with environmentalism? Where does the biblical narrative intersect with creation stewardship, with earth care? Particularly when we look through the lens of permaculture, where do these two stories intersect? Initially, it's safe to say that God cares for all of creation, even more deeply than those who work with even the greatest religious fervor. God placed humanity on the earth to be stewards and creators there, and though the relationship has been broken, the calling remains. This is almost exactly what the permaculture ethics require of their adherents as well. If first you care for the needs of the earth, then the needs of humanity will be met with abundance. They are living into this original creation mandate by taking care of the earth in a way that God designed it to be. Though many of them do so from a position of enlightened self-interest, which is essentially the belief that what is good for the community is also good for me. And although it sounds good initially, the goal and motivation of such behavior is ultimately the individual's happiness, which so it is just filthy, ragged selfishness dressed up in a rental tux. God, on the other hand, calls us to receive from Him so that we might give. My needs have been met so I can give to the point of death and suffering so that others might have life. Our reward is not a return on investment. Others, like Mollison, are motivated by intense anger and fury over the injustices of the world, while God is also angry at these and furious at these injustices. His motivation to act is driven by love to the point of death, and we model after Him by doing the same. So, environmentalist motivations may not necessarily be grounded in gospel realities, but much of their work seems to live out the creation mandate and the imago Dei, the image of God in the world. Just like the church, they long for shalom, this perpetual harmony. They see the world's problems as consumption, ignorance, and greed, and they work towards solutions and changes to these problems at the extreme local level, starting with themselves and their communities. They, as one of my people I interviewed said, put their money where their mouth is, or rather, their actions where their mouth is. Yet, they don't seem to have an answer to the question posed by Mollison in 1989. Why does society, with all their skills, intelligence, and resources, keep falling into holes of their own making? We know that it's because of the brokenness of the fall that has seeped into the hearts of every person. The serpent is prowling the earth, seeking whoever will allow him to work destruction and death through them. And our battles are not with flesh and blood, but against the cosmic powers of darkness and the spiritual forces of evil. For this reason, we cannot bring humanity into the permaculture promise of abundance without the help of God. Our chains are both physical and spiritual, and He is the only one able to break them both. There are many other areas where permaculturalists seem to deviate from kingdom realities, but there are also many places where they seem to get it in a profound and layered way. Specifically, I'm not going to address the agnostic, atheist, or neo-paganist spiritualist tendencies of the group. I feel that those categories have a considerable amount of literature already devoted to them, and I don't think they really get at the heart of what makes permaculture unique. However, multiple times I've alluded to the fact that there seems to be a significant Christian presence in the permaculture movement. And though initially I was surprised by just their presence, I was further surprised when I interviewed them at the depth of their spiritual understanding and faith. These were not people who just claimed the name but were far from God. And these permaculture Christians that I interviewed seemed to also share a collective story. The church, in their experience, has been resistant to creation care initiatives, branding it a creation worshiper lifestyle instead of a creator worshiper lifestyle, and that this earth care is not supported by Scripture. Quite frankly, it seems that the church has lost their authority on what I refer to as the first great book of God. Some refer to this concept as general revelation, and it gets its root from Romans 1, particularly focusing on verse 20, which reads, "For His invisible attributes, namely His eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world in the things that have been made, so they are without excuse." The idea is that God has designed creation to be woven with His character, and by experiencing creation we can see, learn, and deeply understand who He is. When we reject engagement with the physical world, we've effectively mastered one book of Revelation at the expense of the other. If the gospel is intended to be a lived reality, we can no longer ignore the living and physical things around us. We have to remember Jesus was physically raised from the dead, and the Sabbath requirement of the law is for people, plants, animals, and soil. If God was only going to redeem the spirit, He would have no need to raise Jesus physically from the dead. If He cared only for the soul, He would have no need to provide rest for the soil. Creation stewardship is our first commandment, and in all our history, we've never been able to get it right. We can no longer sit idly by and allow creation worshipers to do our jobs for us. As one permaculture Christian I interviewed said, we as believers should be the best environmentalists on the planet, preserving, taking care of, and protecting the earth. We should be above and beyond what anyone else says needs to be taken care of, and we're not. It's so sad to me that it's so hard to wade through all the environmentalism today and find something that goes along with our values as believers. We can no longer afford to be hypocrites, talking a good game about creation care and stewardship while making no efforts to reform our personal lives and practices and those of our congregations. Perhaps we might be able to point to the hypocrisy of those environmentalists being pro-choice while saving baby whales and trees. Yet to the environmental community, a Christian who goes to a Sanctity of Life rally and stops off for Happy Meals along the way is just as hypocritical. Everyone has stories of non-Christian hypocrisy, but what about ours? We can no longer entertain conversations about possible solutions only to come away saying, well, that was an entertaining conversation, but there was nothing to it but talk. As I interviewed a diverse people about the integrated system of permaculture, many described it as a spiritual experience. Two of the four people I interviewed who were agnostic or atheist said that studying permaculture caused them to feel spiritual or a presence of some higher collected being or consciousness. Eric Tosmeyer, a particularly renowned permaculturalist, says, "I'm not a spiritual guy, but I would say that there is a spiritual enrichment that happens when you make that transformation, when you regenerate a site." Another person I interviewed says, "I have difficulty prescribing to any one religion. I see it as a system benefiting a particular group of people. But at the same time, it's hard to put my finger on it, and in permaculture, there are patterns. There are things that connect us. It just feels like more than coincidence. When you look at humans across the world, most of us are of some religion, and for those who say they aren't, have a religious faith or belief in science. I would say that there's something spiritual out there. I don't think it needs to be labeled. I found that I have connected to that more through learning permaculture." Perhaps this is the Romans 1 scenario, being played out right before our eyes. The people who are intentionally experiencing creation are sensing the presence of God, the grand designer and creator. Clearly, we've missed our opportunity to be a light in the environmental parts of our culture. How do we begin to regain our witness? Well, Joel Salatin, the self-described Christian, libertarian, environmentalist, capitalist, lunatic farmer, standing on the foundation of Augustine, refers to all creation as an object lesson of spiritual truth. That is what the physical world is here for. We need to begin to treat all life as sacred. We need to expand our perspective of what it means to care for life as our responsibility. Salatin gives us an example of this by referring to the first Westminster Shorter Catechism, and any of you Presbyterians that are here will recognize this phrase. The chief end of humankind is to glorify God and enjoy Him forever. But this word glory, what does it mean? Glory means to honor the distinctiveness of something. So we glorify God by honoring His distinctiveness. But does God care if we honor the pigness of the pig or the tomato-ness of the tomato? You see, it's how we honor the least of these that creates an object lesson for how we are going to honor or glorify God. Also, when we honor the pigness of the pig, it's a reflection of how we honor the Maryness of Mary, or the Jaminess of Jamie, or the Johnness of John. The way that we preserve and protect creation is a reflection of how we perceive our imago Dei, our image of God. Our behavior is a direct reflection of this true worldview, and if we neglect to care for creation, to even the smallest microbe, we reflect a belief that God's creation is not actually as comprehensively good as He said it was. Even more poignantly, when we neglect to preserve the goodness of God infused in creation, we reveal to the world that our God is not as universally good as we describe Him to be. Therefore, I'm increasingly convinced that the best way to minister to environmentalists is to begin to join them in the work, which also happens to be the work of our God. and by working alongside them, sharing our motivation and our story of a God that they've probably never heard about, a God that cares for both people and planet. So what do we do? How do we start? How should we then live? Well, as with any large justice issue, I like to begin with a reflection from Julie Clausen in her book Everyday Justice. She says, "Don't panic." All too often, I find that conversations that involve changing our lifestyles result in us feeling overwhelmed at the sheer immensity of the problem. There's too much hurt out there. There's too much that needs to change and too much to tackle all at once. From just becoming aware of the needs of the world to realizing that our lifestyle choices make a difference, to understanding how our faith informs how we approach justice issues, we can feel shaken to the core. To change the world, we must start somewhere. It can be easy to sign a petition or wear a bracelet or put a banner on our blog or a bumper sticker on our car or simply give money to help with a cause. But to really start affecting change, we have to actually start tweaking the way that we live. And yes, I said tweak, not overhaul. So practically speaking, where do we start? What do we do? There are so many competing interests and mantras out there. Think of just the light bulb story from the beginning of the presentation. How do we begin to wrap our minds around what are the next steps we should take? Wendell Berry in The Unsettling of America suggests that we become aware of and support local production to grow for ourselves whatever we can, and to become aware of whom we're buying from and check that their practices are healthy and good. I personally think that growing your own food is the most powerful way a person can enter into creation stewardship. On the one hand, you're not participating in the massive system of corruption, greed, oppression, and pollution that is our modern food system. On the other hand, you're learning to participate with the created order and the many lessons that God teaches us by doing so. Personally, it's my conviction that it's best to try to grow around your home, around your area. But a community garden plot, such as Peterson Garden Project, can be a bigger commitment and step if you feel particularly inspired. If you're looking for more resources on how or what you can do at home, I am soon going to become a certified permaculture designer and consultant. So I would be happy to help you come up with plants and practices that would be uniquely tailored to your lifestyle and space. Permaculture, I really do believe that it can become an instrument of the kingdom of God. It's a design science which harmonizes with the created order and the biblical worldview. Permaculture can be an instrument in the hands of a redeemed people, and it can be used to cause creation to express itself in abundant life, just like Ezekiel's vision, just like the new covenant of Jeremiah. If you want to learn more about permaculture or practical ways you can steward the earth, I have an excessive list of books, music and documentaries, YouTube channels, websites that you might find helpful. If you're not interested in starting to grow your own food, at least begin to support some local production. Go to a farmer's market, join a CSA, try to eat food that's in season locally. There are 2 markets that I know of in Edgewater. One's on Wednesday afternoons on Clark and Berwyn. The other one is across the street from Whole Foods on Saturday mornings. Everybody's heard the reduce, reuse, repair, recycle. I say there's refuse is the first one, to stop consuming. I don't need this. But the point of this funny mnemonic device is to get us to think, to become an informed consumer, to tell the story of the product you're thinking of purchasing. Where was it produced? Where did the materials come from? What was life like for those who created it? How did it get to me? What was the transportation like? What's going to happen to it when I'm done? Where will it go? What will it do there? How will it affect the people after it's been disposed? An area of particular opportunity
is the food scraps, which are thrown into a landfill instead of composted. In a landfill, they become a toxin to the people in the surrounding area and a detriment to the climate as a whole. In compost, however, they become a resource of fertility to produce more nutrient-dense and healthy food. There's a local company, Waste Not Compost. It's based out of Lincoln Square and offers a bicycle-powered compost pickup service. They've also recently begun to sell compostable paper plates, bowls, forks, spoons, knives, all the other stuff. You can compost with them or learn to do so in your home, in your available space. Trust me, my roommates know it's possible even in a studio apartment. Joel Salatin most practically suggests that we get into our kitchen and learn to cook real food. If you need a place to start, Peterson Garden Project also offers, in addition to community gardens, classes on cooking and preparing food at home. The idea is that God did not design a dinosaur nugget muscle group on a chicken, and we shouldn't either. So I leave you with this thought. God designed creation in a particular order, and we see that order patterned into the natural ecosystems of the planet. Typically, these ecosystems manifest their abundance by producing top predator species. For example, it takes over 25,000 acres of pristine Amazon to sustain a single pair of hunting jaguar. We see a similar expression with wolves in the Yellowstone National Park. When the top predator is reintroduced, it transformed the entire ecosystem, even changing the patterns and stability of the rivers within the park. So, come to think of it, aren't we top predator? We seem to be top predator, but we're a predator who has a choice. Are we going to wreck it? Are we going to bring it into abundance? Do we take our position or do we ignore our position? I suggest that we take our position as people of the Imago Dei, the image of God, equipped with skills and knowledge and participating as God's hands and feet in this great choreographed object lesson of His glory. So, may all your carrots be long and straight. May your radishes be large and not pithy. May tomato blossom end rot affect your Monsanto neighbor's tomatoes. May the coyotes be struck blind at your pastured chickens. May all of your culinary experiments be delectably palatable. May the rain fall gently on your fields, the wind be always at your back, and your children rise and call you blessed. And may we, as stewards, leave a legacy of abundant nest beyond what we inherited. Thank you very much. So, now I just want to open up the floor for questions of any kind. There's no pressure, but
why do you think it's taken so long for them to go back to the 60s concept of commune living and getting back to the land?
That's an interesting, I don't necessarily know why. I mean, that's where permaculture originated from that time period, and it's actually been spreading almost exponentially across the planet. So in some ways, I would say the 60s never did go away. Maybe they went away from the mainstream conscious, but the underground current was gaining in momentum the whole time. Like I said, yeah, there's now 2,500 registered projects. That doesn't even mention what I'm doing. It's not registered consultants or designers, but it's just large scale farms. So otherwise, I don't know. What's up, Dan?
As we as Christians, do you believe that we should be protesting, or should we be kind of doing a small thing?
That's a great question. Yeah, so as I was writing this presentation, I was felt that it was easier to split those two motivations up, but really they do kind of sit on a spectrum, and so people kind of find their place on that spectrum. And so I think that we need to be doing both. But I don't think that everybody needs to be doing both, because God brought the church and equipped us with a bunch of different gifts. I mean, we think about the gifts of the Spirit. It's not that everybody has to have everything, but some people need to be good at one thing while others need to be good at another, and we need to pair together. So for me, I would say I can't do the air game. I can't do the protesting and the petition writing and trying to do the lobbying and stuff, because that's just not me. It produces more anxiety than it does produce fruit. And so for me, I need to help people on the ground begin to learn some skills and to gain some knowledge and some confidence that it's okay to kill your first 100 seedlings before your 101st one lives. Because that's what happened to me, and that's what happens to anybody who starts gardening, is you kill a lot of things before you get good. So yeah, I think we need to be able to do both.
I have another question.
Okay.
What is your favorite animal and why? I'm kind of disappointed you didn't cover this already.
Animal or spirit
I got both of you. So I actually been thinking about this quote at the end about being top predator has kind of been bouncing around in my mind for a long time. And two of my favorite artists are both named Bear, which is kind of a random thing. But and the wolf idea of being us, being the wolves of the world, and being reintroduced into the ecosystems around us in order to make it produce to abundance. And so I really want a tattoo of like a half wolf, half bear face as like kind of a reminder of this is my spirit, but also these are some really cool animals. And I know an artist actually who I'm hoping to elicit a design from for this said tattoo. So
Well, you can start by saying my favorite artist's name is Dan.
I would like to know, when and where did you become interested in permaculture, and how has it transformed you spiritually?
okay, Mom bringing out the big question. All right. Well, I think for me, it started with a commitment that when we first got married, that we weren't going to have a TV in our house. And growing up, we had a similar, we had the fish tank in the living room instead of the TV. And so I really liked that, but all we had was this tiny one bedroom, and I ended up borrowing an aquarium from John, and then destroying said aquarium. And so we placed that in the part of the room, the living room, where the TV would go. And so I just really started, it started there, I would say, and just progressed. I wanted an aquarium, and then I was like, well, I heard you can put live plants in an aquarium. So then I tried to learn how to grow live plants inside the aquarium, and then I stumbled across aquaponics, and I can grow plants outside of the aquarium, and it's beneficial. So I bought a tiny aquaponics system, and then was not satisfied there, and so I started gardening in pots with a fluorescent light spread across our living room, which I'm sure my wife loved. And I think it just progressed from there. Started watching a lot of BBC gardening on YouTube, and then stumbled. You want me to describe it better for you? Yeah, I think it went from there. BBC gardening. Alice Fowler is a BBC gardener, and she is also a permaculture certified consultant. And so she never said the word permaculture, but she did a television show called The Edible Garden, I think it was called. And I watched that 4 or 5 times all the way through every episode. And I think after that I was hooked. And so then it was like explicitly looking for that. Yeah, so aquariums to aquaponics to gardening to sustainability. And what was the second part of your question?
How has it transformed you spiritually?
Right, the part that's the bigger part. I think, yeah, it really did awaken me to this concept when I listened to Joe Salatin talk about saying that phrase that I quoted of creation is an object lessons for spiritual realities. And I was struck by that, and having a degree in Bible, I was like, okay, I know this book really well, but I don't understand what he's talking about for sure. And so I started spending some time in meditation about one particular thing or another, and started to see some of the profoundness. Like I'd shared at church a couple months ago, just about compost in general, which just seems like such a trivial thing, but the idea that all things, Jeff Lawton says when he's talking about compost, he says the rule of compost is that all things that have lived can live again. And the idea that things that are dying produce fertility and life. And just seeing this resurrection, all of a sudden it was connected to Jesus. All of a sudden it became the like goosebump tingly moment. I'm looking at my compost pile going, that's weird, right? You're like, what? Like, it's like when you're reading scripture and all of a sudden this jumps out at you. You're like, this is crazy. It was the same thing now that I'm walking through the forest, walking through life, and you're like, this is, God put this here for us to be able to go like, I'm touching this, and this means something real. This is something profound. Yeah, so it's kind of reshaped a lot, I think. A lot for me. So.
I have one more question. Speaking of compost, do you know of any sort of Chicago initiatives to start composting in the city?
Yeah, I have 3 piles in my backyard. And the Waste Not Compost service is in Lincoln Square, and I've been talking to them about expanding into Edgewater and doing a compost pickup service. They literally ride down the alleys and pick up buckets. So they provide you with a new bucket, they'll take your old bucket, and yeah, bicycle powered, right? No diesel, nothing. So, and they also, I think they just started a year ago or so, and they're just starting to provide compost as well to the public for like gardening and stuff.
How well is permaculture received by like the scientific community? Because even thinking about at the beginning when you were talking about the difference between survival of the fittest and like survival of the most cooperative, it seems like it's in that way almost, I mean, maybe fundamentally opposed to that core idea of science.
Mm-hmm.
How does that get reconciled? Is it?
It depends. So in that way, it is an opposition to survival of the fittest because it's survival of the most cooperative. But that doesn't necessarily refute evolution in general. It's just what is driving evolution. And actually, survival of the fittest is a phrase that's coined by evolutionary psychologists and sociologists, not by Darwin himself. So there is that little bit of a division there, but it's not received particularly well. Mollison talked about when he first produced his pamphlets that he was invited repeatedly to large universities and scholarly associations, and they would ask him to speak, and only to in the mind to rip his speech apart after he was done speaking and have it on film and have it on transcript in order to be like, refute this guy, get him out of here, he's doesn't know what he's talking about. And right. Wow. And the issue was for them that, at least when he describes it, is because they were combining all of these different systems. It was not just biology, it's not just study of soil, it's not just the study of trees, it's not just all these categories in science, and it's also the last, I didn't even touch on this, but the last chapter of the designer's manual is strategies for an alternative global community. And it talks about how do you arrange community systems, what is your monetary system like, what is the government system like, what are your regulations going to be like. And this whole idea of being able to actually create the world that you do want, and people were not happy that he was mixing all of those things and picking what he wanted and leaving some of the rest of it, you know. So yeah, it's kind of twofold. There are some scientists that are doing that research. There was a TED Talk, gosh, I can't remember the name of the lady. She is doing research with trees, particularly. And what they do is they bag one of the limbs so that no air can get in, and they inject it with a mildly radioactive carbon molecule that is taken up like CO2. You know, the plants take that and they produce oxygen. And so it's radioactive because they want to be able to trace where it goes. And so if that's the fertility that the plant is taking in, where is the fertility going? And so they can use the Geiger counters, the things that, like when you're tracing radioactivity, that are like, and the louder it gets, the more radioactive it is. And so on a normal tree, it doesn't do anything. On this tree, it starts going, and so they go away, and they come back 3 days later, and every tree in the forest has this radioactive carbon molecule in it. And she's like, okay, is this just the species, like the fir is trading with the fir, is trading with the fir, is trading with the fir? And she found that wasn't even the case either. It was many different species of trees were all sharing nutrients that were when they were attacked by a bug or they were cut, they were sending out a bunch of pheromones into the air, and other trees would start producing antibodies for the toxins without even being in contact. So there is a little bit of a science to the cooperation as well.
It's like the ants.
It's like the what?
The ants.
Yeah. Coming in, yeah. So they had, yeah, man, there was one in Africa, a tree that was killing elk or antelope on a reservation because they would come up and they would eat it, and then the other ones would know that they were getting eaten, and so they would produce a toxin. Like miles apart from each other. So it's crazy, man. That's what I'm talking about. You get to understand the interconnectedness of this, and you're like, God knew what he was doing. Like, we got to stop messing with that. Like, what's happening is working. So I could talk all day, so.
He's got water.
Well, I have a question. Do you think you talked about making little tweaks. Do you think there are any good little things people can do if they're I don't want to support like big companies that are destroying the environment, but I can't afford to shop at my local organic store?
Mm-hmm.
What are some little things I can do to...
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I've been playing around with that idea. For me, like I mentioned before, growing your own food is kind of the biggest, most empowering thing for me. And so I do think about that. It's just a small thing, like grow one basil plant that you don't have to buy. You know, just start with one head of lettuce. You know, on average, one head of lettuce uses 150 gallons of fuel just in transportation from the farm to the store. So every time that truck makes that journey is 150 gallons of gas, not including all of the production of it, you know, or the energy used in displaying it in these brightly lit grocery stores. So if you can grow one plant, you're already saving all of the fuel, all of the, you're taking your money and support away from all of those large destructive companies. And I say on a second note, composting is a really easy way, and I think Aldi even is starting to carry organic products, like at least buy something from there, you know. It's just, if it's just one purchase to start, eventually your life can begin to change. You have to start with one little thing. and Joel Salatin talks about that a little bit too. For people who say that they can't afford good food, they can't afford to shop at, say, Whole Foods, which he himself refers to as whole paycheck.
Yeah, facts.
He says, well, what are you spending your money on? Because last time I checked, the cost of cancer was a lot more expensive than the cost of preventative healthy food. So he's like, you need to support your body. You need to be able to do that. And so if that means that you don't take 2 vacations a year and you only take 1, like, start cutting wherever you can, because this is actually beneficial for more than just the world. It's beneficial for your health as well. So yeah, just start small. Shop at Aldi. Like, grow one thing.
And a good place to start with growing one thing would be
Me.
And then if you need to buy plants, seedlings or whatever.
Peterson Garden Project.
Yeah.
Mhm.
The 7th is the Foreign Crops. Plant statue.
What about recycling or reusing other things? How can that help us? Or what things do you get from the dumpster or garbage?
Yeah. Yeah. Take all of your things and rebuild stuff out of them. Repurpose materials instead of trying to recycle them. Recycling is good. It's not as good as reusing or repairing something. Recycling actually burns a lot of fossil fuels. And essentially we're not putting things in a landfill, but we are polluting the environment by trying to reuse them or trying to recycle them and make them into other products. So, yeah, repurpose things.
Paper products saves you money.
Yeah.
It's a good place to start.
Yeah, and so the thing is, stop using things that are recyclable and use things that are more permanent. Don't buy paper plates, do the dishes. That's sort of a deal. The longer you invest in the lifetime of the object, the better. The higher quality is, the better. I know John's leading in because half of our backyard infrastructure is built out of dumpster finds. Wood and plastic and all sorts of car mats, and the mulching is with all of the autumn leaves. I think we pulled like 45 bags of autumn leaves that we stored, and now they're almost gone, turned into dirt back there. So yeah.
In a culture where he who has the most money has the most voice in government, you see commercial farming advertisement. They're good for the environment, good for the economy. How does permaculture butt heads with that kind of giant?
Oh man, they don't get along. Yeah, I think it's all branding. It's all this. If you can project yourself. I just saw in National Geographic, dang it. National Geographic had an ad for Cargill, which is a huge agricultural company that produces pesticides and fertilizers, and it's in National Geographic. And the advertisement says, like, spend your money on sustainable farming practices and stuff. And I'm like, oh my gosh, I can't do this. How is this happening in National Geographic? All right. And so when they're able to brand themselves as sustainable now, that word has, a lot of permaculture people have stopped using that word because sustainable doesn't mean anything anymore. Just like natural for your groceries. You're like, everything's natural, you know?
Natural flavoring.
Or organic. Everything is organic. But yeah, I guess technically, yes, the lettuce that you grow is organic, but it definitely wasn't grown that way. And that's why I think, why I love permaculture and why I think the ground game is the place where I belong, is because Bill Mollison says that growing your own food is the most seditious thing you can do. You're empowering yourself and your local community, and you're separating, you're not putting money in to feed the giants. And but growing your own food is peaceful sedition. It's not rebellion. It's not protest. It's not riots. It's not stirring it up. You're just slowly withdrawing yourself. And that's really, at the end of the day, I think all that we can do. And then being in a community of people that are also separating themselves, not putting the money in to feed the giants. But I don't think they're ever going to go away. I don't think the big capital-intensive corporations are ever going to go away. And if you look at the book of Revelation, I don't think God thinks they're going to go away either. I think they're going to be the beast and the dragon and the monsters at the end that are fighting the people who are trying to do good in the world. And at the end, it's going to have to be an act of God to really make all things universal. But all that we can do is do the best that we can for our families, our friends, our communities. So.
Sounds like you need to write a metal song.
I've been waiting to write another metal song. Go ahead.
Is it just because you can't make any money in permaculture?
That what?
That like the big companies are successful because you can make money, but maybe permaculture you can't really do that?
Thanks for the softball question, John.
And
you know what? I've been waiting for somebody to ask this too. Is the question that Joel Salatin and Bill Mollison and all of these people get after every presentation is, that sounds cute and all, but how are we going to feed the world? You know, like, that sounds nice for you, but I have a family to feed, so you just play with your plants, and then I still have to go to work and do this other stuff. So that's what the projects and demonstration sites that I referenced, the 2,500 different sites, are designed to be set up as examples of profitable farms. There's one in Wisconsin, Mark Shepard's Restoration Agriculture. It's about 4 or 6 hours away. He's one of the models. He's on 120 acres. He is in the heart of ag land of Wisconsin, and he had the University of Wisconsin, their agricultural extension, that they do all of the soil analysis for the big commercial farms, and he had them come out and do a couple years study on his property. And what they found is that he was producing 30% more human calories per acre than the cornfields of his neighbors. And so, will it work? Well, yes. So his management system is they have 30% more calories per acre, and they're building soil the whole time. They're building ecosystems. There are threatened species that are making homes and nests on their property, and they're not a threat at all. And he's on 120 acres. He's producing a massive amount of food. And they're at the point now, what he says in one of the documentaries is, he's like, we're at the point now where we're cutting down trees. Like, we have too many productive trees, so we have to cut down trees, which is now a problem. Now we have to turn this wood into furniture, and we have to turn it into functional items that now we produce more income. And so Joel Salatin is kind of the champion of profitable agriculture, and he does all this ecological management, and his farm produces on average 3 or 4 times more money, more dollars per acre than a conventional farm, while building soil, while producing purely grass-fed beef and pastured chickens and pork. And so he's got all of his T's crossed and his I's dotted, and he's making a killing financially. And he's only distributing to his area. He lives in the Shenandoah area. He doesn't ship out. People come and pick up the food, or they drive it to, I think they drive to DC once a week. So it's building soil, it's benefiting the ecosystem. You can make a killing money-wise, and you're producing more food to feed the world as well. Yay. Thank you all for your questions. That was amazing.
Yay.
All right.
Yay. Thanks for your time. It was a long time,
That was awesome.
Yep. 2 hours.
but I didn't expect you to ask so many questions.